The antique music box arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper that smelled of dust and forgotten years. Sarah Matthews had been expecting it for weeks, ever since she'd won the auction from that obscure estate sale website. The seller's description had been sparse. Victorian music box, circa 1880, plays for Elise, needs minor restoration. What had caught her attention wasn't the piece itself, but the photograph accompanying the listing. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate brass inlays and mother-of-pearl details that seemed to shift and dance in the camera's flash. As an antique restorer specializing in musical pieces, Sarah knew quality when she saw it, and this box radiated an elegance that modern reproductions could never achieve. She'd paid more than she usually would for such items, but something about it had called to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. When she carefully unwrapped it in her workshop that evening, the reality exceeded even her heightened expectations. The wood was a deep mahogany that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the metal components showed the kind of patina that only centuries could create. The top bore an elaborate engraving of a dancing couple, their faces turned away from each other in what appeared to be sorrow or perhaps shame. Sarah ran her fingers over the surface, marveling at how smooth it felt despite its obvious age. She gently lifted the lid, expecting to hear the familiar ping of a music box mechanism, but instead was greeted by silence. The interior was lined with faded red velvet, and the brass cylinder that should have held the musical arrangement was missing several of its delicate pins. This would be an interesting restoration project, she thought, already mentally cataloging the work required. She'd need to research the original melody, source appropriate materials for the missing pins, and carefully clean the mechanism without damaging the intricate gearing. As she examined the piece more closely under her magnifying lamp, she noticed something peculiar about the engraving. What she had initially taken for decorative flourishes around the border were actually tiny, precise letters. Squinting, she could make out fragments of words in what appeared to be Latin. "Memoria eterna," she whispered, recognizing the phrase. Eternal memory. How fitting for a music box that was meant to preserve melodies across generations. She made a note to research the piece's provenance more thoroughly, wondering what family had owned it and why they had eventually let it go. That night, Sarah left the music box on her workbench and went to bed with the satisfaction of having acquired a truly special piece. Her dreams were unusually vivid, filled with waltzing figures in elaborate Victorian dress. Their faces always turned away so she could never quite see their features. She woke several times throughout the night, each time with the strange sensation that she had been listening to music, though her apartment was completely silent. The next morning brought the first signs that this restoration would be unlike any other she had undertaken. When Sarah entered her workshop, the music box was no longer where she had left it. Instead of sitting square in the center of her workbench, it had somehow moved to the edge, precariously close to falling. She was certain she hadn't placed it there, but reasoned that perhaps the old building's settling had caused the bench to shift slightly overnight. More puzzling was the fact that the lid, which she distinctly remembered closing, was now open. As she approached to examine it more closely, she noticed something that made her breath catch. There, in the thin layer of dust that had settled on her workbench overnight, were small indentations that looked remarkably like footprints. Tiny, delicate footprints no larger than her thumb, leading from the music box to the edge of the bench and then simply ending, as if whatever had made them had taken flight. Sarah shook her head, attributing the marks to her imagination or perhaps some quirk of how the dust had settled. She had always been prone to letting her imagination run wild when working on particularly interesting pieces, and this music box was certainly that. She carefully moved it back to the center of the bench and began her preliminary examination. The mechanism was more complex than she had initially realized, with several additional components that she couldn't immediately identify. There were tiny gears within gears and what appeared to be a secondary cylinder that wasn't connected to the primary musical mechanism. As she worked, she found herself humming tunelessly, something she rarely did while concentrating. It wasn't until she paused for lunch that she realized the melody she had been humming was for Elise, note perfect, despite not having heard the music box play a single note. The afternoon brought another peculiarity. While researching similar pieces online, Sarah came across a newspaper article from 1923 about a mysterious series of disappearances in Prague. The article was brief and written in stilted English, clearly translated from Czech, but it mentioned a music box matching her piece's description. According to the report, 5 children had vanished over the course of 2 months, all from families who had recently acquired antique music boxes from the same dealer. The authorities had investigated but found no connection between the disappearances and the music boxes, eventually attributing the incidents to human trafficking, though no evidence was ever found to support this theory. The article was accompanied by a grainy photograph of one of the music boxes, and while the image was poor quality, the distinctive engraving of the dancing couple was unmistakable. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to think rationally. Coincidences happened, especially with antiques that had long histories. There could be dozens of similar music boxes produced during that era, and the newspaper photograph could easily be of a different piece altogether. Still, she bookmarked the article and made a note to investigate further. As evening approached, Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the music box alone in her workshop. The feeling was irrational, she knew, but something about the piece seemed to demand constant attention, as if it were somehow aware of her presence. She decided to take it upstairs to her apartment, reasoning that she could continue her research on her laptop while keeping an eye on it. The music box felt heavier than it should have as she carried it upstairs, and once again she had the distinct impression that she was humming Für Elise, though she couldn't remember starting. That night, Sarah's dreams were more intense than before. She found herself in what appeared to be a grand ballroom, watching dozens of couples waltz to music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The dancers moved with perfect synchronization, their elaborate gowns and tailcoats flowing like water as they spun across the polished floor. But as the dream progressed, Sarah began to notice unsettling details. The dancers' movements, while graceful, seemed mechanical, as if they were wound-up toys rather than living people. Their faces, when she managed to glimpse them, were pale and expressionless, their eyes closed as if they were sleeping or perhaps dead. The music that accompanied their dance was for Elise, but played at a tempo that was somehow both too fast and too slow, creating a disorienting effect that made Sarah's head spin. She tried to move closer to get a better look at the dancers but found that no matter how far she walked, the ballroom seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The only constant was the music box, which sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, its lid open and mechanism spinning endlessly. As she watched, tiny figures began to emerge from the box, each no larger than her thumb, dressed in the same elaborate costumes as the full-sized dancers. These miniature people joined the waltz, spinning and turning with the same mechanical precision as their larger counterparts. Sarah woke with a gasp, her heart racing and her nightgown soaked with sweat. The apartment was dark and quiet, but she could swear she heard the faint echo of music fading away, as if someone had just turned off a radio in another room. She reached for her bedside lamp, and in its warm glow, she saw the music box sitting on her dresser exactly where she had left it. But the lid was open again, and she could have sworn she saw a tiny figure disappearing into its depths, like a mouse scurrying into a hole. Sarah spent the next day researching with renewed urgency. She contacted auction houses, antique dealers, and even reached out to several European museums that specialized in mechanical music boxes. What she discovered made her increasingly uneasy. There were indeed multiple reports of music boxes matching her piece's description, spanning over a century and covering most of Europe. Each report was connected to unexplained disappearances, usually of children, but sometimes of adults who had been involved in collecting or restoring the pieces. The pattern was always the same. Someone would acquire one of these music boxes, become obsessed with it, and then simply vanish, leaving behind only the music box and sometimes reports of strange music heard in the vicinity. Most disturbing was an account from a Swiss police report dated 1956. A music box restorer named Heinrich Müller had been found dead in his workshop, apparently of natural causes, but the circumstances were bizarre. His body had been discovered seated at his workbench, his tools arranged neatly around him, and one of the mysterious music boxes open before him. The strange part was that Muller appeared to have shrunk. The police report, which Sarah found in digitized archives, described the body as being roughly 2/3 the size of a normal adult, though the coroner could find no medical explanation for this condition. The music box had been destroyed by Muller's terrified family, but not before a local priest had examined it and reported hearing the voices of the trapped coming from within its mechanism. Sarah tried to dismiss these reports as folklore and superstition, the kind of stories that naturally grew around mysterious objects over time. But as she continued her research, the accounts became too numerous and consistent to ignore. There were similar reports from England, France, Germany, and even a few from early American collections. The music boxes always played Für Elise, always had the same engraving of the dancing couple, and always seemed to exert a strange fascination over their owners before tragedy struck. As the days passed, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly possessive of her music box. She had stopped working on other projects, dedicating all her time to researching and attempting to repair this single piece. melodies. She moved it from room to room with her, reluctant to let it out of her sight for any length of time. Her appetite decreased and she began losing weight, though she was too preoccupied to notice. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams of dancing figures and mechanical music, and she often woke to find herself humming Für Elise with perfect pitch and timing. Her friends and family began to worry. Phone calls went unanswered, and when her sister stopped by unannounced, Sarah was reluctant to let her inside, claiming she was too busy with an important project. When pressed, she showed her sister the music box and was disturbed by the woman's reaction. Her sister, normally appreciative of Sarah's work, seemed frightened by the piece, claiming it made her feel watched and asking Sarah to put it away. After her sister left, Sarah found herself angry at the woman's reaction, defensive of the music box in a way that surprised her. It was just an antique, after all, a beautiful example of Victorian craftsmanship that deserved to be restored and appreciated. The fact that others couldn't see its beauty wasn't her problem. It was during the second week of her obsession that Sarah made her first real breakthrough in repairing the music box. She had been working late into the night, carefully cleaning the mechanism and trying to understand how all the various components fit together. The secondary cylinder that had puzzled her initially was beginning to make sense. It appeared to be connected to a series of tiny hammers that would strike additional notes, creating a more complex melody than the simple tune produced by the main cylinder. As she worked, she found herself singing along with the melody in her head, her voice getting stronger and more confident as the night wore on. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice when her voice began to harmonize with itself, as if multiple people were singing the same song in different keys. It wasn't until she paused to rest her eyes that she realized the workshop had filled with music, though she had never successfully gotten the box to play. The melody was Für Elise, but as she had never heard it before, with layers of harmony and counterpoint that seemed to come from dozens of invisible musicians. As she listened, mesmerized, she began to see movement in her peripheral vision. Tiny figures were dancing on her workbench, spinning and leaping with impossible grace. They were no larger than her thumb, dressed in elaborate Victorian clothing, and their faces were turned away from her just like in the engraving on the music box lid. Sarah tried to focus on them directly, but found that she could only see them clearly when she wasn't looking straight at them, as if they existed in some space between reality and imagination. The dance continued for what felt like hours, the music growing more complex and beautiful with each passing moment. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure if they were from joy or sorrow. The melody was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, and the dancers moved with such grace that she found herself wishing she could join them. As if responding to her thoughts, one of the tiny figures broke away from the group and approached her. It was a woman in an elaborate ball gown, her face still turned away, but she extended one minute hand toward Sarah in invitation. Without thinking, Sarah reached out with her finger to touch the tiny hand, and the moment they made contact, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her body. The world suddenly shifted, and she found herself standing in the grand ballroom from her dreams, wearing a gown identical to those of the other dancers. The music surrounded her completely now, not just heard, but felt in every fiber of her being. She could see the other dancers clearly for the first time, and was shocked to recognize faces from the photographs in her research. There was Heinrich Müller, the Swiss restorer, dancing with a woman who must have been one of the disappeared children from Prague, though she now appeared to be a grown woman. There were dozens of others, all moving in perfect harmony to the endless waltz. Sarah tried to speak, to ask questions, but found that she could only move to the rhythm of the music. Her feet began to dance of their own accord, and she realized with growing horror that she couldn't stop. The dance was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever experienced, but it was also a prison. She could see the desperation in the other dancers' eyes, even as their faces maintained expressions of serene joy. They were trapped, she realized, caught in the music box's spell, and forced to dance for eternity, while their bodies in the real world slowly wasted away. As this understanding dawned on her, Sarah fought against the compulsion to dance, but the music was too strong. With each step, she felt herself becoming smaller, more delicate, more like the tiny figurines that had first emerged from the music box. She could feel her life force being drawn into the mechanism, feeding the endless waltz that had already claimed so many others. In her last moments of clear thought, Sarah understood the true nature of the music box. It was not just a mechanical device, but a trap, designed by some long-dead craftsman to capture and preserve human souls in eternal dance. The Latin inscription she had noted wasn't just decorative, it was a promise. Memoria eterna, eternal memory. The music box remembered everyone who had ever been drawn into its spell, keeping them alive but trapped, dancing forever to the same haunting melody. Back in the real world, Sarah's body continued to work on the music box, her hands moving with mechanical precision to complete the restoration she had started, but her eyes were blank now, unseeing, and she had begun to shrink just as the Swiss restorer had decades before. Her fingers, now delicate and tiny, made the final adjustments to the mechanism with impossible skill. As the last pin was placed and the final gear aligned, the music box began to play for the first time in decades. The melody of Fur-Elise filled the workshop, note perfect and hauntingly beautiful. Inside the mechanism, tiny figures danced in elaborate ballroom formations, their movements synchronized to the music. Among them, barely visible unless one looked very carefully and knew exactly where to search, was a new dancer in modern clothes, her face turned away in eternal sorrow, her feet moving to a rhythm she could never escape. The music box played for 3 days straight before finally winding down. When Sarah's sister came to check on her, having not heard from her in over a week, she found the workshop empty, except for the music box sitting open on the workbench. There was no sign of Sarah anywhere, just a small pile of clothes beside the bench and a note written in handwriting so tiny it required a magnifying glass to read. "The dance is beautiful. The music never ends. Do not wind the box again." The sister, despite her fear, found herself drawn to the intricate mechanism. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and she could see tiny figures frozen in the gears, so detailed they almost looked alive. As she leaned closer to examine them, she noticed that one of the figures bore a striking resemblance to Sarah, though it was impossible to be certain at such a small scale. Fighting against an inexplicable urge to wind the music box and hear its melody, she instead closed the lid firmly and contacted the local authorities. But the police found no evidence of foul play, and with no body to investigate, Sarah's disappearance was eventually classified as a missing person case. The music box was placed in evidence storage, where it sits to this day, waiting in the darkness for someone curious enough to open its lid and discover the beautiful, terrible secret hidden within its mechanism. Sometimes late at night when the police station is nearly empty, officers report hearing the faint sound of music coming from the evidence room. It's always the same melody, played with mechanical precision but somehow filled with indescribable sadness. Those who have heard it describe it as the most beautiful and most haunting tune they have ever encountered, and several have requested transfers to other departments rather than risk hearing it again. The music box remains unopened, its lid sealed with evidence tape that has yellowed with age. But the tape has begun to crack, and sometimes, in the right light and at the right angle, observers swear they can see tiny figures moving within the darkness of the sealed box, dancing eternally to music that only they can hear, waiting for the day when someone will be curious enough, fascinated enough, or foolish enough to lift that lid and join their eternal waltz. The collector who originally sold the music box has long since disappeared, his website defunct, and his contact information leading nowhere. But sometimes, on obscure auction sites, and in the dusty corners of antique shops, similar pieces appear. They're always described in sparse terms. Victorian music box, circa 1880, plays Fur-Elise, needs minor restoration. The photographs are always slightly blurred, but those who know what to look for can always spot the distinctive engraving of the dancing couple, their faces turned away in eternal sorrow. And somewhere, in the space between reality and dreams, between the tick of clockwork and the beat of the human heart, the dance continues, growing larger with each new soul drawn into its beautiful, terrifying embrace.